Hey everyone, Ben here. Just with a little request that if you are enjoying the podcast, go to your local podcast app, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Amazon Prime, and make sure to give us some stars. 5 is great, but whatever you think it deserves, and that really helps to put us on the map. Also, feel free to go over to patreon.com/theliminauts and pitch in with a monthly $5 donation if you want to support the project and help me get off my butt and interview other people. So without further ado, here's the podcast. Welcome to the Liminauts podcast. Interviews with individuals testing the liminal spaces between disciplines, perspectives, and practices, with a focus on Buddhism, spirituality, science, philosophy, and wellness from a left perspective. I'm your host, Ben Hawes. Reverend Mark Unno is professor of Buddhist Studies and department head of religious studies at the University of Oregon, specializing in Pure Land Zen and Shingon Buddhism. He is the 14th generation minister of Shin Buddhism in his family. He is also the president of the Society for Buddhist-Christian Studies. Mark was also my thesis advisor in college. We discuss what the social responsibilities of being a Buddhist are and what the differences might be between Zen Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism in their approaches to community. Enjoy the conversation. So, Reverend Professor Mark Unno. Mark, wonderful to talk to you. Thanks for coming on to my podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I wanted to have you on because I've talked to now 4 different Buddhist practitioners. Well, actually, you're the 4th teacher, 5th Buddhist practitioner, and this is nominally a Buddhist podcast, though not exclusively. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was the organization of Buddhism in the West in society, and also historically, and how, say, Pure Land versus maybe Zen Buddhism, how they have reacted differently to society and how that kind of plays out now, and trying to understand how Buddhism is not so socially involved in the West, whereas historically there's lots of examples of involvement, and certainly some branches of Buddhism, some schools, some sects seem to be much more than others. And so I kind of wanted to talk about Buddhism and society, both historically and currently, and as just of historical interest, but also thinking of like, what is the way forward given all of the challenges we're facing of, climate change and possible human extinction at an accelerating rate, and what our duties are as people who are pursuing a path that is for the sake of all beings. So maybe you want to talk a little bit first about Shin Buddhism, and since a lot of people, the people listening may not know as much about that as about other more well-known forms for Zen practitioners or for Western practitioners such as Zen or Tibetan Buddhism. Or Vipassana.
Those are some pretty big questions, and you raised a lot of themes. So there's a lot of ground.
I'll be bringing them all up. No worries.
So just thinking about your potential audience, I'm just gonna give a few highlights about Buddhism generally, and then the development of Zen and Pure Land, and then Buddhism in the contemporary West. So first we have to sort of make a small note about the category or idea about religion. So religion in the West is very, very different historically from religion in Asia. Mm-hmm. And religion, after all, is a Western idea. Mm. So religion in the West really is based upon the three biblical religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Mm-hmm. And they share a lot of things, but one of the main things that they share, especially in their formative periods, is that they are comprehensive worldviews that cover everything, both in terms of time and in terms of space. So what does that mean? In terms of time, it means that they've got you covered from the moment of birth, coming of age, marriage, and then through the latter stages of life and death. So, for example, Catholicism is much older than Protestant Christianity, and Catholicism still today, there's no divorce because it's not really something that humans did to bring two people together. That's why they can't decide to divorce, because it's something that was sanctified by God, right? So, and then in terms of space, well, it covers not just the religious space of like a church or a synagogue or a mosque, but it covers the entire social space. So Judaism, Christianity, especially in the development of Catholicism, and in Islam, they had rules and laws that covered almost everything. So including the slaughter of food source animals. So like you have kosher laws in Judaism, in crimes. So that meant that each religion created an entire society, what the sociologist Peter Berger calls the sacred canopy. But religions in Asia have been very, very different. Religions in Asia have been role-based. So each religion has fulfilled a certain role or niche within society. So in India, when Buddhism arose, somebody asked the Buddha, when the first monk died, what should we do? He said, just follow local customs, which from our perspective would be Hindu customs. Mm-hmm. And the Buddha didn't perform any marriages either. So most people were both what we today would call both Hindu and Buddhist if they were followers of the teaching of the Buddha. Or in China, so you could be exclusively Confucian or exclusively Taoist, but most people were both. Because most people would be Confucian at work, Confucian at formal occasions, Confucian when order in the family was important. But in relation to nature, in relation to leisure time, they were much more Taoist. In Japan, most people had a Shinto-style wedding ceremony and then a Buddhist funeral, right? Mm-hmm. So religions were role-based. So when we think, well, what is the role of Buddhism in relation to society? Eventually, Buddhism did develop to be much more comprehensive, but it still, even today, still retains some of that sort of role-based or niche-based flavor. So it's a very, very different question to raise. What is the vision for the future? What is the vision in the face of global crises? To ask of a comprehensive religion like Christianity versus a role-based religion like Buddhism, right? So we have to remember that. The second thing to note is that Christianity has become the dominant religion in the West, and globally, over 30% of people identify as Christians. So it's the largest religion by far. And Christianity, perhaps more than any other religion, has been influential in creating social structures and social institutions. Why is that? It's related to the first point, which is when Christianity spread through Europe, well, you couldn't be Christian and pagan at the same time. Why? Because Christianity provided answers for everything. So you couldn't go to local gods because Christianity already had the answers.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just didn't work to belong to multiple religious streams, whereas Asia, that was quite common because the function of religion was quite different, right? So what happens then when problems arise? Well, you've got a new religion, and that spread through Europe based on the power of the Vatican, which is an urban power. So when problems arise, you have to create new institutions. So that's how hospitals arose. That's how insane asylums, which became eventually the precursors for psychiatric asylums, which became the precursors for psychiatric hospitals, arose. So social institutions, social services were built structurally, institutionally, in the wake of the development of Christian culture. Well, what happens when we look at Asia? Well, maybe some of that's there,
Mm-hmm.
but in Asia, social issues, social support systems were developed much more organically and locally.
Mm.
Why? Because you didn't have to displace all of the local customs and practices that were in place, because Buddhism came in to fulfill certain roles, and the other religions and other belief systems and practices still often continued on. Now, it wasn't that Buddhism was always peaceful. No, sometimes Buddhism went in as a takeover religion, co-opting local gods as protector deities and so on and so forth. So it wasn't always peaches and cream. But it didn't displace all of the local practices, including social support systems. So, for example, if you go to Kyoto today, you find some of the most important psychiatric hospitals in the northern part of Kyoto, near a temple where the main Buddha is Baishajaguru, or Yakshi Norai, the medicine Buddha. So the medicine Buddha is the Buddha that's the healer Buddha. So in that area in northern Kyoto called Iwakura, then families were known to take in people who today we would diagnose as schizophrenic or having other psychotic conditions or disorders such that people couldn't function in society. So it wasn't that social problems weren't tackled,
Mm-hmm.
but it's that they were dealt with much more on a regional, local, village, organic level. But as the entire global society has become much more westernized, industrialized, much more mobile, much more capitalistic, and much closer to resembling Western structures, then you started to need structures that mimicked or borrowed from Western forms, like psychiatric hospitals, like social welfare systems, like unemployment offices, right? So, and yet many of these sort of local, regional practices still persist in Asia. So I'm most familiar with the case of Japan. So if you go out to the countryside, it's quite common that a person that Western medicine would diagnose as having a psychiatric disorder will go to a psychiatrist, but will also go see the local shaman. And when it works well, then the psychiatrists know the shamans and they work together. Mm-hmm. And that really doesn't happen much in the West, although we're seeing some signs of that, right? So first, in physical ailments, you're a prime example of how non-traditional approaches to medicine and medical care have come to be recognized and can work in tandem with Western medicine, right? So acupuncture, moxicottery, and other forms. But what we're beginning to see now is increasing understanding of how entheogens, psychedelics, right, psilocybin might have a legitimate role to play in psychiatric care and pain management and other areas. So that's something that comes outside of the introduction of modern European or modern Western sort of structures and practices that draw much more on indigenous practices. So we're seeing some signs that that might be possible. And Oregon, where I live, is the number one, laboratory for that. So
in Colorado now too, with our legalization. Right. Yeah, so we just followed Oregon with a statewide decriminalization of psilocybin, and we are establishing a therapeutic licensing regime for creating therapy centers. And then the regulators have the option of bringing in all the other psychedelic plants. So ibogaine, ayahuasca, different cacti, and mescaline cacti. So that's all changing, and I can tell you that there's all sorts of psychotherapy that's now happening, say in conjunction with ketamine, in conjunction with people doing MDMA, in couples therapy, people who are doing psilocybin sits, who are also licensed counselors, and those sorts of things are also happening on that level. Plus, there's not to name. I mean, in addition to all the mindfulness and yoga-based and contemplation-based counseling that's happening. So certainly and that's counseling, right? That's psychotherapy, which of course is not, big M medicine. But psychiatry right now is looking at certainly ketamine, and MDMA is likely to be legalized for prescription for, in conjunction with therapy very soon. And so, yeah, that is certainly changing. That paradigm is certainly changing.
Yeah. Well, and we'll have to see. So it's very typical in many contexts, but certainly in our culture, we have very big pendulum swings, right?
Yes.
So we had a very big pendulum swing from Obama to Trump, back to Biden, and that also can be seen in cultural norms. So we're seeing a huge backlash against issues related to transgender, to LGBTQ+. So we'll have to see what happens with those kind of things, because there's always a reaction to a large movement culturally, action-wise. So we'll have to see. So that gives you some idea of the background of Buddhism. The next thing I want to just briefly touch on is Buddhism in the early phase, and then the second big phase of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, the Buddhism of the Great Vehicle, is the form of Buddhism that spreads through much of East and North Asia. So East Asia is predominantly China, Japan, Korea, and then Vietnam. North Asia is Tibet, Nepal, and Mongolia. And Mahayana Buddhism does start to become more comprehensive, provide a bigger umbrella as a worldview as it moves through different countries. And eventually, Pure Land and Zen become the largest movements of East Asian Buddhism in China, and then Japan, and then Korea, as well as Vietnam. In China and Vietnam, Pure Land and Zen fuse together. So you find both in the same temple. In Japan, they remain different schools or different sects. But in the background, there's a lot of overlap. So what is their view of problems in society, and many of the problems we're facing today, like climate change, like the war in Ukraine, big natural disasters that have a significant human factor that plays into it, like the pandemic. So scholars have done a lot of work on the ways that Buddhism throughout its history have engaged social issues. But before we get into specifics about that, it's really important to understand worldview, because Mahayana Buddhism has a very different view of time and space than Western religion and much of secular society in the West. So secular society in the West, there's a few defining features. One is our sense of time is history. And it's infused with a particular sort of value. So history is linear, history is real, and history is positive. So those are the three defining characteristics of time in Western society that come straight out of the Bible. It's real, and it's even more real than it is in the Bible because there's a tension between earthly time and divine time. But in secular society, divine time becomes a myth, and myth can have real positive significance, but it's never quite as real as history. So material history is the bedrock of reality. Mm-hmm. And it only goes in one direction, and it goes straight from past to present to future. And it's a positive movement. And that also comes from the Bible, specifically from the New Testament. So the statement that really reflects this in a big way is when Jesus says in the New Testament, the kingdom of God is near at hand. He doesn't say the kingdom of God is here. He says it's near. It's coming. There's going to be an apocalypse before then, but it's coming, right? So the whole idea is, the good stuff is always in the future. Mm. We have good stuff now, but it's going to get better, and we're going to get there, and it's going to be real, and there may be bumps along the way, but it's going to be a straight road there, one way or another, right? So what is the view of time in Buddhism that came out of ancient India? Number one, time is not a straight arrow. It is cyclical. It just keeps coming back. The same things keep coming back over and over, right? Second, time is an illusion. So for Buddhists as well as for Hindus, and in a slightly different way for Taoists, the categories of time, past, present, and future are not very reliable, and they're not the basis for how one enters into the deepest realization of reality. In fact, you have to let go of all these categories and enter into the deep flow of oneness of the Tao, the wordless Tao in Taoism, the oneness of absolute knowledge of reality in Hinduism, and the realization of nirvana, emptiness that is emptied of all human categories, the positive expression of which is oneness beyond or even before words in Buddhism. So historical problems, political crises, war, pandemics, all of these things are addressed as real experiences, but not real ultimately. So that's a very, very big difference. Now, it's not that Taoists and Buddhists and Hindus don't have any sense of history. They have some sense that it's like if you take a big, big circle and you cut a small chunk out of it, it looks relatively straight.
Right, yeah.
So it's not that they don't have a sense of history, but history is placed in the context of a much bigger cycle. So what happens when they look at what we might regard as historical time? They say perfection lies in the past, and everything's downhill from there. So that's true for the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Confucians, and the Taoists, the four big Asian religions, right? The golden
right. We're always in the end stages of the Dharma. The Dharma is always dying.
Right. And why is that? It's for two reasons. One is true enlightenment, awakening, is something that is fully embodied. So when was the perfect embodiment of enlightenment or awakening? It's the Buddha. Right? Now, there were people who became enlightened after the Buddha, But the view of all of these religions, including Buddhism, is that, well, did the Buddha really set out to found a large religion that was eventually going to spread throughout the world and save everyone? No. Buddhism doesn't begin with, here, I'm raising the flag and we're going to go get them. No. It begins with what? The great hesitation. He doesn't want to teach. He doesn't want to teach. He says, no, because the only way that I can teach what I learned, which is beyond words, is to use words. But words are a very, very imperfect tool for conveying enlightenment. And what's going to happen, because my audience is unenlightened by definition, they're only going to get part of the meaning. And what's going to happen as a result of that is that there's going to be imperfect understanding, even though there will be people who become fully enlightened. And as the organization grows, it's going to inevitably create competition, envy, political problems. So I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it, he said. But the gods implored the Buddha, and eventually they said, no, you have to go out and teach, because look at all these suffering people. So he reluctantly agrees to go out and teach, knowing that he's initiating a movement that's going to create a big mess.
Open mouth, already a mistake, to quote Zen Master Sung Sa.
Already a mistake, right. And but he's made it basically a wager, right? So the wager is the benefits going to outweigh the negatives? That the ability to spread compassion and enlightenment is going to outweigh the problems that are going to be inevitably result from this process. So what that means is that Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism have historically been very conservative, because perfection lies in the past. It lies in embodiment. And we're going to get farther and farther away from that in the short term. And short term really means 10, 20,000 years. Whereas in the West, perfection lies in the spirit. So this world is profane, and the body, if anything, has a little bit more negative valence, because you're trying to free the spirit from the defilements of the body. So you see that from very early on in Christianity, for example, in the letters of St. Paul, right? And so, but we can improve this world, and the spirit will lead us there. So without that, you don't have this huge belief, really a religious belief, even in secular society, that we don't have perfection now, but the promise of perfection lies in the future. And we're going to harness the spirit and realize that. So progress is really dependent on the spirit, which is closer to the intellect than to the body. So the body could be messy, but the body will eventually catch up. That's the vision. So it's not that Buddhism or Christianity, one is the better or the other. No, they all, because I'm a scholar of religion, if you look at the history of any large religion, it's quite messy. There's the highs and the lows, the good and the bad and the ugly, right? So no religion is better than any other religion. That's a nonsense statement. Why is that? Because you find good people, bad people, middling people in every religion. How can one religion be better than the other when you have, all different kinds of people in every religion? And also in the non-religious sphere, I mean, there are good Marxists, there are bad Marxists, there are good anarchists, there are bad anarchists, so whatever, right? But right now, we are running up against a problem that's very, very hard nut to crack, which is expressed in multiple interrelated or interlocking pieces. So the one that most people are aware of, especially young people, is climate change. Mm-hmm. First research publication on climate change published in 1958, scientific paper. First testimony before Congress that climate change is the biggest challenge facing humanity, 1985, Carl Sagan. Yes. And then again in 1988. Then we had Al Gore's movie, which came out in like 2005. Okay, now they're saying, we have 3 to 5 years before we hit 1.5 degrees centigrade. Global warming is still accelerating. Are we going to be able to, to slow down global warming in the next 3 to 5 years when we know it's been around for over 60 years? Well, if you're going to place a bet in Las Vegas, which way are you going to place that bet, right? So a lot of intellectuals, a lot of scientists, a lot of academics, which is my area. A lot of people in Congress are still trying to get things done, which probably is a good thing, right? But if you talk to young people who are well educated, so college students in their 20s, they're not buying that any of this is actually going to pan out, right? So climate change is the biggest, but it's only one of many, many factors. Mm-hmm. So global economy is pretty much locked into some form of market capitalism. And if you just look at population growth, carbon-based emissions, we were bumping along in an agricultural society globally that dominated until the early to mid 19th century. So it's only been 150 years at most that suddenly human population completely exploded. And then we had massive consumption. And then we had massive industrialization. But it's only going to be a couple of decades before the entire global human population maxes out and begins to decline. And it's already beginning to decline quickly. And it only started in the last 10 years. That's China, Russia, Japan, South Korea, Ukraine, Europe. All of these societies are aging rapidly, and the absolute number of the population in many of these countries already declining. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the biggest changes in the history of our species, a species that has locked itself into an economy that requires borrowing from a growing consumer base in the future to feed present industrial production. So that's another thing. So young people most of them are not analyzing demographics and economics, but they sense it. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh my God. So this is the whole thing against the boomers. It's like, you guys took all our stuff and there's no stuff left for us. So, there's not a lot of, well thought out research that's behind that, but their intuition's strong and it's probably right. So the next generation, it's very, very difficult. And, the most reliable source for knowledge about climate change is the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's best scientists. Well, every year, their estimates for melting of the polar ice caps, for sea level rise, vastly underestimated every time they take a measurement every year. So what does that tell us? It's not going to be good, right? So I think, the IPCC says we need to mitigate. We need to mitigate, but we cannot rely on mitigation because disaster is already baked in, and we see that all over. So has to be a combination of adaptation and mitigation. We have to adapt to inevitable disaster as well as try to mitigate. Now, we cannot innovate our way out of this.
Right.
Right. That's the main thing. We cannot innovate our way out of it.
There's not enough copper in the world to electrify all of our vehicles.
No. And look at how much carbon-based production is required to electrify global society. I mean, the amount of carbon monoxide that's going to be released into the environment by just creating all of this technology is massive, right? So the Buddhist take on this is, well, we tend to measure progress on making it possible for the next generation to have greater financial wealth, greater social opportunity, greater social equality, greater longevity. And I mean, everybody wants these things. Whether you're in the East or the West, whether you're Asia or Europe or America, everybody has always wanted these things. It's a good thing to want. But there's a good chance it's not going to work out that way. So the Buddhist view is, well, this whole notion of what's desirable and undesirable is really biased in one direction, and it's not inherent to human existence. Whether we're going up the up cycle or the down cycle, that doesn't affect the quality of our existence in any one way.
Mark, I think your hand is hitting the mic.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So Buddhist view is whether you're living or dying, if we truly receive each moment of our existence fully, then we will be completely fulfilled. So, one could say we need a combination of both. We need to do whatever we can to leave good things for the next generation, to make progress on all fronts, technology, the environment, planetary conditions, but at the same time be able to draw on Asian traditions like Buddhism that say it's really not about problem solving on the horizontal plane of history. That regardless of whether we're going up or down, as a species or individually, it's about how to realize our true depth in each moment by becoming fully present. And I'm just going to give you one example of that. So my father was a pioneer as a scholar of Buddhism. He was a pioneer in our tradition of Shin Buddhism. He wrote the first two books that were published by mainstream American press, Anchor Doubleday, on Shin Buddhism that introduced Shin Buddhism, and they were well received. And so he was well known for his work in the Buddhist world. He taught for 35 years at Smith College in Massachusetts. He was very active after he retired for 10 years, taking many trips and speaking at many Buddhist temples and centers. But when he reached his mid-70s, he had some prior health issues, and they kind of crept up on him. So he was starting to slow down. My mom was starting to slow down. They moved to be with us here in Eugene, Oregon in 2007. And they had a small Buddhist group in Northampton, Massachusetts. So they said, hey, we'd like to do something here. So at that time, I said, well, we could just do family Sangha, the four of us, my mom, my father, my wife, Megumi, and myself. But I said, well, if we're going to have family Sangha, then we can invite a few friends over. So we get like 10, 12 people together. We do a Buddhist service. There would be some meditation. And then I would turn to my father and I would say, Dad, do you have a message, a Buddhist message for us? And he would, speak briefly. But as time passed, he had greater and greater difficulty coming up with these messages because he had what's called vascular dementia. So this is not Alzheimer's, but that his heart was not pumping oxygen at the same rate that it was before. And because of that, he just couldn't formulate thoughts as quickly. So he was still himself. He was still very coherent. It's just that he couldn't formulate things as quickly, and therefore he couldn't speak as quickly and as articulately as before.
Mm-hmm.
So we did this for, I don't know, we did this for like 6 or 7 years, every month. But of all the times he spoke, I only remember one message that he shared. So we did meditation, we did chanting. And then I turned to him, I said, "Dad, you have a message for us?" And he nodded, "Yes." I said, "Okay, why don't you go ahead?" And he goes, "It's good to be alive."
Mm-hmm.
You know, at that point, he was starting to have difficulty walking. He was starting to have significant problems with short-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
He could not be, you know, the main speaker if we were having an event. And yet, out of the depths of his being, he said, "It's good to be alive." And even though he wrote 2 books, many, many articles, that was one of the best talks that he ever gave. Yeah. Because that is the yes to life that comes from beyond the opposition of yes and no. It's a complete yes, saying, yes, this moment is great. And it's so great to have this moment. And in that, there's packed so many things. It's great to be with everyone. Right? It's great to be able to enjoy meals together. But it's not just the good things, because he had illness, he was frail, he was beginning to be forgetful. He's saying, everything, nothing is wasted. Nothing is wasted. There's deep love, there's deep compassion, just in being here right now. And that's not despite of getting old. It's not because of, it's despite of losing some of my memory. No, it's because it includes everything. Everything, yes. Everything we experience in human life makes us who we are. So if people think about, well, what are you most proud of? Maybe people have accomplished a lot in business. They've been able to raise a family, right? They've enjoyed success in their community. They've received social recognition. But many people will, when they reflect deeply, will say, you know what? When I faced really, really great difficulty, illness, separation, and loss, I didn't lose it. I found a way to receive that experience of pain and suffering as an intrinsic part of what it means to be human. And that's really what's allowed me to connect with other people's pain and suffering. And those connections run much more deeply than just having fun and good times together. Yeah. When we think about friendships that really last, real friendships are based on when that person's there for you, when it's not convenient, and when you've got their back, when everybody else has disappeared. Then you know who your real friends are. Then you learn the real meaning of compassion. So when people really think about, wow, you know, what have I really accomplished in life? Then integral to it, maybe at the heart of it, is I didn't run from the difficulty that I had. I was able to find a way to face it without blinking. Receive it into my life, receive it into my heart, understanding that suffering is part of who I am and my existence. And so that later on, I could open my heart and relate even more deeply to other people, and not just people, but other creatures. because everyone suffers. Everyone experiences unavoidable pain, unavoidable loss. So, in this moment, we want to really get beyond so many enormous problems that face not just each of us individually, but as a species. But some of these things we might not solve in the traditional ways that we've solved them, technologically, financially, economically, politically. But in fact, it may be that when we run up against problems that we really can't solve outwardly, spiritually, religiously, these are actually moments of opportunity to go much deeper and to realize that whether we can solve these outward problems, which we all want to solve, that we can grow, deepen, develop, and connect spiritually. And in fact, for us as a species, that may be as or more important than whether we solve these outer problems. Because long before, for many of us, long before these problems are on our doorstep, and it's already happening in some ways, people are going to be less willing to share. They're going to be hoarding more. They're going to become more selfish. Why? Because it's just human nature. It's much easier to be generous. It's much easier to share when you have more than enough. What happens when things become more scarce, including time, when time starts to seem, less available, then what's going to allow me to share, to be generous, to connect with others? And it has to come from a recognition of shared suffering. So I think this is available in all religious and spiritual traditions: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism. But certainly it's a hallmark of Buddhism that it focuses on this problem, as we see in the first noble truth. Life is suffering, which just means there's going to be times, multiple times, when life doesn't go the way I want it to. For me individually, for my family, for my community, and now maybe for my species. But that's not the conclusion. No. When we go deeper, then it opens up into profound peace, nirvana, a profound letting go, emptiness, and then even deeper connection, great compassion. And this is the heart of both Zen and Pure Land. Yeah.
So I want to pivot from the shared suffering to concept of shared struggle, which I'm thinking of right now, because I had on the podcaster Matt Christman, and Matt Christman is interesting because he was basically a Marxist who then had a spiritual awakening and has become something of a mystical Christian and Buddhist. But he's really thinking about spiritual solidarity. And we talked about Marx's idea of the lumpen proletariat as a sack of potatoes versus de Saint-Sonim's idea of throwing potatoes in a bucket, agitating them to wash them all together, as opposed to washing each individual potato on their own, in his idea of together action, right? And so these are, because Marx was saying, basically, if people aren't put together where they work with each other, it's just atomization. And people become basically inert on their own for changing anything. Right. And one of the things that you talked about capitalism. One of the things that capitalism likes to do is to really, atomize us completely. Right. All structures eventually melt into air. All that is solid melts into air. All of our structures, family structures, right. Schools, education system is now dissolving. Work is dissolving. Everything right. is dissolving into the individual atomized right. self. Right. And even our communication is now more and more virtual, one-on-one, disconnected. We don't have this agitation of all of us living cheek to jowl and having to learn to live with each other.
Right.
And so, I guess one of the reasons I was so looking forward to having you on was because coming out of the Shin Buddhist, the Pure Land tradition, at least in the United States, is much more of a family-based tradition.
Right.
It is community-centered, and the Pure Land tradition itself has much more of a history of social involvement than say Zen. So it's not only even Asia versus Western thing, but I think there's something about the Pure Land tradition too that's a little bit more anchored. And so I wanted to ask you about why you think we don't have this family Buddhist tradition that it seems to be the predominant paradigm, and what you think. Do you feel like in the United States that the family-based Shin Buddhist paradigm is growing and viable, and it is a counterbalance or countervalence to this atomization?
Right. Yeah. So I think you captured a lot of key points about Shin Buddhism, which is part of the larger of Pure Land Buddhism. So Pure Land Buddhism in East Asia has always been more lay-oriented, and being more lay-oriented has been necessarily more family and community-oriented. And reflecting back on what I said earlier, that community orientation and family-based orientation has been more organic than structural. So just to give an example, my grandfather came to this country in 1935 as a Shin Buddhist minister. And in the early years of the Shin Buddhist communities, which formed in North America and in the U.S. Under the organization of Buddhist Churches of America, a very large percentage of the members were farmers and gardeners and other things, but large percentage were farmers. And they were minority. Initially, they were not allowed to own land. So they were quite poor. It was quite typical that they would give half of their earnings, so half of their salary, to the local Buddhist temple. So they didn't have much to begin with, but they'd give half to the temple. And now Buddhist churches, BCA ministers are salaried, but ministers were not salaried. So it was all based on dana, based on donations. But so there would be monetary donations, but many of the donations were food. When the lay members gave half their salary to the temple, what did they get in return? Well, the temple was the extended family. So if there were medical needs or there were educational needs or something, other members from the temple would rally around that particular individual or family and provide what they needed. And there could be several generations growing up in a particular temple. So my grandfather was minister at Shin Buddhist Temple in Los Angeles. My mother grew up with Lodi Buddhist Temple in the Central Valley in California. So, that's always been part of the Pure Land tradition. It's been an organic community that supported each other materially and spiritually. But this was actually true for many immigrant communities. That's why a very large percentage of religious institutions in America are ethnically based. So you have the Irish American Catholic Church, you have the Polish American Catholic Church, you have the Scandinavian Lutheran Church, and you have, the Taiwanese Buddhist Temple, the Japanese American Pure Land Temple. So many of these communities that were centered, immigrant communities were centered around religious institutions, and they organically support each other. They no longer serve that function nearly as much because church participation has gone way down, but also because of social mobility, right? So because of social mobility, people don't raise their families where they grew up. Especially if you grew up in a rural area and you got an education, then jobs aren't available, or if you got a college education, good, well-paying jobs aren't available, so people leave. So there's been the emptying out of rural America, which really was the heart of community for much of the world, not just the U.S. In the Japanese American case, there was another big problem, which was the internment. So in World War II, Japanese Americans, over 100,000, were thrown into internment camps. And when they came out, many of them were not allowed to gather religiously. And then so the adults who came out of the camps were called the Nisei, the second generation. And they worked extremely hard to assimilate into American society because they had to succeed financially. And a very large percentage of that population, they might have spoken a little Japanese, but they were socialized and educated in English.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the other thing is they did not want to talk about the camp experience to the third generation. It was too painful. Because of that, there was a complete cutoff from the first generation to the third generation. I'm the third generation. My age group is the third generation. So many Japanese Americans who were younger, because of the change in society, social mobility, educational, economic opportunity, loss of language, the internment experience, culture were completely cut off. So many Japanese Americans of my generation are struggling mightily because they don't have that organic connection to community. But that's not just Buddhism. Many religious communities have suffered enormously. So you can see that, for example, in many Jewish communities because of the Holocaust and the huge, problems that has caused for Jews in America. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So there is a model there for the development of organic community. On the other side, flip side, American Buddhism. So there's a big difference between ethnic Asian Buddhist communities, which are temple-based. Mm-hmm. So the Vietnamese Buddhist temple, the Japanese American Buddhist temple, the Cambodian American temple, and the non-ethnic center-based Buddhism. So center-based Buddhism, typically people go there just for a weekend sit, or they go for a retreat, but they're not very active in forming and committing to community. That's changing. So there are more Buddhist communities that we call sanghas. There are more sanghas that are more community-based now. I think that's changing some. But it's still the center-based model where people are going for retreats for their own individual spiritual development. And that's still going to continue to be prominent. Why? Because Buddhism in America is at its core very, very entrepreneurial. Because we're living in an entrepreneurial society, it's an individualist society, it's entrepreneurial. So in Asia, if you wanted to go deep into Buddhist practice, then you would learn from the local priest, can you introduce me? Or maybe the local priest is an inspiring teacher, but if not, they couldn't introduce you to a Buddhist master. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not the way it's done in America. No, you have to have a website. You have to be on social media. And the biggest way to grow your Buddhist audience is if you publish a book. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in traditional Asia, you didn't buy Buddhist books. No, you had to hand copy with brush and ink. If you wanted a copy of a Buddhist scripture, you had to get permission from the priest, and then you had to do a contemplative practice, which is to copy it in brush and ink. Now you can just order off of Amazon, and you're going to see, what's the star rating, what's the reviews, and that's how then you're going to be able to go on tour. Then you're going to be able to grow your community. It's a very different model for a religion, especially think about Zen, that's very skeptical about linguistic expressions of enlightenment, right? So, I mean, you look at how did Zen Buddhism develop as a tradition? Well, by producing a lot of sayings of the masters that debunk scripture. So, I mean, it's nothing new, right? But still, culturally, it's quite different. That if you want to make a splash in the Buddhist world in the West, then one of the biggest ways. So, not to name some names, but we have some very prominent Buddhist teachers now, some of whom who wrote one book that made a big splash, and that's how they made their career. Yeah. So I'm not going to name any names, and that's legitimate. These books have helped people, and there's a difference between somebody who writes books and is a really good teacher or great teacher, and somebody who writes books who's not. So somebody who was very articulate, had great intuition, a lot of wisdom to offer, but was a complete wreck in their personal lives was Alan Watts.
Right.
So I actually think that, there's a lot of great material in his books, and that can be inspiring. But he was not a spiritual teacher. He was an alcoholic. He really didn't do any serious kind of Buddhist practice. But that's, so it's important to kind of be nuanced. Does that eliminate the value of his work? Not at all. In the sense that if you understand what the limitations of drawing on his works are, they can still be of great value. Just know that there is some relationship between the style of his expression and the fact that, well, he wasn't he couldn't take care of himself, not just in a Buddhist way, but like as a normal human being. But you know what? A lot of these great masters, oh my God, there's so many Buddhist scandals. It's just ridiculous, right?
Well, I was going to say, do you see that as different from, say, someone like Chogyam Trungpa, who was practicing, also famous alcoholic?
Yeah. So recently there's been a huge scandal that was always there, but really broke open with Trungpa's son.
Yeah.
Right. That's been a big issue. And Trungpa himself, I mean, basically he died of cirrhosis of the liver, being alcoholic. And now we can see that the problems around the sexual scandals weren't just that he was sleeping around in consensual relationships. No, there was abuse of power. There was very likely there was sexual assault taking place. So, so the problem there is that there's many problems there, is that progressive liberal Buddhists who we see in the mainstream media, so who are published in journals like Tricycle and Lion's Roar, and who publish books. These are not all the Buddhists, but the Buddhists who have media visibility tend to be very progressive left-wing in their political orientation. And there's a significant number of that crowd that wants to say, well, we have to make allowances for the fact that it was the 70s and it was his wild teaching style. So there's going to be some fallout from that, but the benefits far outweigh the negatives, right? So there are some people who say that. But would the same people say that of, Catholic fathers? No. So there's kind of a double standard there. Sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, sexual abuse in Buddhist communities. So I think it's important not to have double standards first. But the second point is probably figures like Trungpa, he probably did have some extraordinary spiritual ability in some areas. Yeah. I never met him personally, but I have enough experience that when I read accounts of how inspiring he was, and I know some of his direct disciples who were prominent teachers, he definitely had some extraordinary qualities that he could manifest. Does that excuse his misbehavior? Absolutely not. Especially now, we have a much clearer understanding, which should be applied retrospectively, that you have to understand the difference in power dynamics. And this language really didn't exist 20 years ago, of people really understanding that it's really not appropriate for a male who has enormous institutional or community power to put their hands on the shoulder of a young woman without asking. No, it's not acceptable because it's much more difficult for somebody who has so much less power to refuse that, even if they're uncomfortable, right? So let alone, rape, sexual assault, all these other things. So, and none of these things are necessary for the path to enlightenment. So there are a certain number of people in a larger, so both men and women, and probably non-binary or transgender as well, who say, you know what, I did have this encounter. It was a positive experience for me. So there are people who report positive benefits from having an intimate encounter with a spiritual teacher. Hey, that's fine, right? But is that necessary? No, it's not necessary. Okay, it's not necessary. So just don't do it. Because even if there's one person who comes and says, you know what, it really hurt me, it traumatized me, then you shouldn't have done it. Because the person in authority is always responsible, because they're the ones who have the power, they're the ones who have the authority, and the person who's coming to them for teaching or for help is inherently coming in a helpless state. So the person in the position of authority always is responsible and must always be accountable. Okay. But the other side of it is it's impossible to eliminate the risk of a problem arising.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Because no matter how enlightened a Buddhist teacher is, they're probably not perfect. And most importantly, they're probably not perfectly in control of themselves. So mistakes are going to happen, right? But there's such a big difference between a pattern of behavior versus somebody saying something that's limited, doing something that's highly limited, where they made a mistake, they fully took responsibility, they apologized, they paid some price. There's a big difference between that and a pattern of behavior. So should people be able to make amends? Yes. Should they be allowed to make a mistake and still remain within a community if they make amends and other people agree? I think there should be room for that, because everybody's just human, right? But I mean, even if it's one action, if it's very egregious and clearly the person should have known better, then they could easily be kicked out, and rightfully so, right? So, so there is a problem if cancel culture is applied too severely.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because everybody makes mistakes, right? But still, the person in the position of power and authority must be responsible and must be accountable.
Do you think part of this tension then between abuses and then cancellation is simply because we are so atomized and have so little solidarity together that there's no kind of horizontal counterbalance to this structure? Because, right. It always will be the case that there will be people who have more experience, have maybe a deeper understanding, whether you want to call it, whether you want to say that they've had an enlightenment experience, or they've had a breakthrough, or they've come to a deep understanding of the Dharma, and therefore they are the teacher. but there needs to be a stronger sangha, right, in terms of horizontal solidarity in order to counterbalance that, right? You need good students to have a good teacher, and vice versa, right?
That's right. That's right. So it's so ironic, or I don't
and
know
that's
if it's
different in Asia. There's that's where the community basically it's like you can't get away with the same kind of shenanigans, or if it is, it's very discreet. The monks go down to the local ladies of the night, and they go to the local bordello, and they come back and they maintain propriety, and it's everything is understood that there's a certain at least that's how it is in Korea.
Right. Well,
because they don't have the married monastic tradition. There's some, but it's not uniform.
Right. Well, that even happens in Japan, and that's another topic. There's a lot of different sort of light to shed on that. There's issues there. Okay, but you're absolutely right. Why? Because in Asia, there's many more checks and balances.
Mm-hmm.
So Asian Buddhist leaders have had problems, but they tend to be checked much more easily, much more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So Buddhist communities in North America, they've all had, basically they've had a board of directors or a board of trustees. But in the first couple of generations, generally, it didn't work very well, because whenever there was a problem, they didn't know how to solve it because they didn't understand Buddhist practice, Buddhist culture, Buddhist customs. So default, they would just turn to the primary teacher in the first generation, who would be an Asian master, and say, we don't know what to do. You tell us, right? Second problem is that the place of the Buddhist master is very different from the place of, for example, a Christian minister. So the strength of Christianity and the power of Christianity derives significantly from the uniqueness of the Christ event. The Catholic father or the Protestant minister is tiny compared to Jesus, is merely human in relation to Jesus. But Buddhism built its power on the opposite model. Mm-hmm. That every enlightened master is the equal of the Buddha himself.
The mind-to-mind transmission.
Mind-to-mind transmission. So you did a great job on your senior honors thesis in writing about all these issues. I still go back and read it sometimes. It's great example of comparing what the Zen master Dogen said in the 13th century and applying it to the problem of the transmission from Suzuki Roshi, founder of San Francisco Zen Center, to his successor, Richard Baker, who had all kinds of scandals, sexual, financial, and otherwise. So you did a great job on that so many years ago, right? So we're really coming full circle, Mark and Ben.
And that Richard Baker saga was an example of, there's a board which basically was a rubber stamp, and then all of a sudden, 180-degree flip, and then kicked him out,
Right.
No rehabilitation. And so, very interesting. Thank you very much. I'm glad somebody out there found my hard work valuable on that thesis.
Other people have read it, so I've shared your work.
Maybe you understand it better than I do at this point, because I read the Dogen stuff, and it's like there's such a deep frame that I have to flip into in order to be able to untangle the tangling vines.
Right. So let's return to this problem of community, right? So Pure Land, much more so than Zen, is community-based. And the Pure Land minister is regarded as being much more among the congregation rather than standing above it. So still the minister wearing robes is still seen as an important teacher, but it's much closer to the congregation than the Zen master is to the lay audience, right? So that gap is an issue. And when Buddhist teachers are seen as gurus, and Tibetan tradition, there's a special problem because the guru, the ideal of the guru is that the guru's every action and every word and deed is a manifestation of the perfect teaching. Tibetans themselves have a much more nuanced and subtle understanding of it. They understand that, yes, at one level we accept that, and then at another level we understand that Rinpoche is just a human. But in the early period in American
because at
Buddhism,
a certain level, everything in your life is a manifestation of the perfect teacher.
Exactly, right. But in the first couple of generations in the U.S., there wasn't time to develop that nuanced understanding. So, all these other problems come in. So things are likely to get much better now that we've gone through this. But there is another phase we need to go through, because right now what we've done is most Sanghas now have much clearer ethical guidelines. So that's a good thing. But you can't regulate out bad behavior. It has to be a culture of the right kind of behavior. And then if you also place too many restrictions, then it can cause problems, because at the heart of Mahayana Buddhism at its heart is transgressive in every way, including being ethically and morally transgressive. But there's an appropriate way to be transgressive and an inappropriate way to be transgressive. Why is it necessarily transgressive? Because it breaks down any rigid ideas, any rigid structures. Emptiness says will cause suffering. So inherently in both Buddhist thought and practice, Mahayana Buddhism is transgressive, but has to be done in the right way. So that's part of the difficulty. And that's why we have like the crazy wisdom tradition. Okay, to a certain extent that makes sense. But look, we had all of these great masters like in Japan, like Hakuin and Bankei. Okay, they never had sexual scandals. No. And you look at a figure like Hakuin, there's one story there that really stands out. Is there was a woman who became pregnant out of wedlock, and she was ostracized, and he took her in, and then people started accusing him of impregnating her. And initially he didn't deny it because he was trying to protect her. But eventually everybody found out, no, he was not the father. He remained silent because he was just trying to protect her, right? So that's the opposite. He's transgressing the rules of whether a monk should be together with a woman. He's breaking the rules, but he's breaking
Is that the one
rules.
where he says, "Is that so?" They say, "Is this?"
Yes, is that so, right? But he's doing it out of compassion to protect her, and he does not violate her. So there have been many great Buddhist masters who have been like that, and that's the right understanding of transgression and compassion, right? So getting back to the issue of community, there's a big difference between a purely political, secular social activism, Marxist or otherwise, and a Buddhist-based one. And the difference is whether you're going to engage social systems and try to help transform them by placing the blame outside of yourself or not. That's the simple thing. So you only intensify problems when you put yourself on the side of the morally pristine righteous side, and the other side is purely evil. That is going to only exacerbate problems. Even if you win, it's going to create problems, because it's like isolating what you consider to be a quote unquote criminal element. What are they going to do? They're going to fight back. They're going to fight back at the peril of their life, because their life depends on it. So this is what's happening right now politically in our country, is we have the extreme right and the extreme left claiming each side is morally pure and righteous, and the other side is purely evil. Yeah.
But even Marx had this very similar idea to codependent arising of, the dialectical materialism, right? That basically material forces through structures create limitations on our consciousness, right? It doesn't create it wholesale, but it certainly limits our horizons and the way that we behave by creating these pressures into which it's very hard not to take the path of least resistance, whatever that is. And in all of our relationships and in your daily life and, in your job and the economy and what you do. And everybody is the subject of this, even if some people are, it's basically the system itself is, through the real material pressures that are both created by and create the system, create these things. Right. And that's very similar to me to Buddhist ideas of codependent arising, right? We are, we are not merely cause and effect, but also we are the creation of everything that's happened before us in the entire universe.
So there are some passages from Das Kapital and from Engels that are very, very Buddhist in flavor, right? Mm-hmm. But I would still say that basic orientations, there's big differences in practice. Why? Mm-hmm. Because in the Marxist vision, there's justified violence. And in the Marxist vision, it makes sense in a way that's extremely compelling, because it doesn't really matter how much you massage the ruling class, they're not going to give in. And so the proletariat must rise up and displace the ruling class, because there is no peaceful way to do it, right? So there's justified violence in the Marxist vision. And you have to pay attention to that, because if you are a woman, if you are a racial minority, if you are a minority in other ways, and I'm a racial minority, just being nice and approaching people with loving kindness is not going to get the job done. Mm-hmm. Because it's structural, right? So right. That's the thing about Marxism, because it's structural, right? So I get that. I have first-hand personal experience. But the Mahayana Buddhist approach is very different, exemplified by the layman Vimalakirti in the Vimalakirti Sutra. At one point, Vimalakirti takes a pearl necklace and he breaks it in half. So he's got half the pearls in one hand and half the pearls in the other. And he throws half the pearls to the wealthy and half the pearls to those who do not have wealth. So that's a different model in practice. And the basis behind that is the wealthy deep down within are suffering as much as those without means. And the goal is not economic liberation, which at its heart, Marxist view is that liberation of subjectivity requires economic liberation. The Buddhist model is true liberation requires freedom from having to exist at all. So it's a different model.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. But can they coexist? Yes, they can. Why? Because they can be understood to operating at different levels. That's how
relative and absolute freedom, or relative and absolute liberation.
But the way that you implement the Marxist vision is going to be very, very different if it's undergirded by a Buddhist sense of compassion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because if you are having to correct structural wrongs and the other side has to give up something in that process, then if you come from a Buddhist perspective, you're not going to say, I won. You're not going to behead Marie Antoinette. It's not going to happen. It's going to say, okay, pick up a broom. You're going to clean up the house along with the rest of us. Okay, that's what's going to happen in the Buddhist picture.
I mean, it is interesting in times like my first guest on the podcast, Kurt Steinmetz, is a Zen master, and also quite knowledgeable about his both Buddhist and Western history. And so we talked about Sosan Tesa, the Zen master who rallied Buddhist monks to defend from the Japanese invasion Korea in 1592. And the Buddhist troops were famous for the compassion they showed their enemies and treated them humanely. And but they were told when in order to defend yourself, you will have to accept the bad karma of killing. And right. they did that on a mass scale, as soldiers. So all the monasteries were converted into troops.
Right.
So there is a model for self-defense tempered by compassion that is done. The acceptance of this bad karma and understanding that this is not a victory. We are, by doing this, we are accepting we have already lost, but it still must be done in order to prevent worse suffering.
Right. So, one place to look for additional clues and insights is the Bhagavad Gita. Because the Hindu vision of the Bhagavad Gita is non-dualist in a way that resonates with Buddhist non-dualism. Mm-hmm. And it's maybe virtually contemporaneous with the Buddha. So Arjuna, the protagonist of the Gita, and Siddhartha, they're both coming from the warrior class, the Kshatriya, but their karmic circumstances greatly differ. And so the result is very different. So Krishna says, okay, so Arjuna doesn't want to go into battle because now there's a kind of a intra-clan conflict that unfolds over many sort of epic cycles of the Mahabharata that crystallizes in the Gita. Families are gonna go to war over the honor of a princess, but that would mean that Arjuna is gonna have to fight and kill cousins, uncles, former teachers, and he doesn't want to do it. He wants to take the renunciant path, which eventually Siddhartha, his virtual contemporary, eventually does. But Arjuna says, no, you can't do it. Krishna says you can't do it. You can't do it because of two reasons. One is your intention is wrong and your karmic circumstance is wrong. Your intention is wrong. Why? Because you don't want to go into battle because you don't want to kill, your kin. But that's being attached to life. You will not attain liberation from the illusion of life versus death if you're gonna take the renunciant path in order to avoid killing your kin. Second, circumstances are wrong because if you abandon your army, they will be slaughtered because they're gonna lose their general. And you're gonna forever regret it because you're neither gonna gain liberation nor victory. So go into battle, but without attachment to the outcome, without expectation of victory. Then what's going to happen? You're a warrior, but your status as warrior will not depend on winning and losing. And what you're going to see is the other side is just like you. The other side is fighting for their own, just like you. And then the separation between self and other, friend and foe, good and evil will dissolve before your eyes. And more importantly, your heart will open even as you kill your cousin, your heart will open. Right. So just think of people who joined, the Army or the Marines or the Navy because many reasons, right? there's a disproportionate number of African Americans who join the armed forces. Why? Because it provides technical skill, education, and most importantly, economic opportunity they're not going to get otherwise. They're not going in because they want to be sent into battle. No, they do not want to go into battle. But what are they going to do when they're sent into Iraq or Afghanistan? No, they're going to fight to win. But there's a world of difference between a person who goes in to win and stands over the body of the enemy combatant, bloodthirsty, declaring themselves superior, versus somebody else who goes in knowing, I don't want to kill anybody, but if I don't take out the enemy, then my platoon's going to get wiped out. And if there's any injured soldiers on the other side, we're going to send in the medics and do the best we can. But this is not just soldiers in Afghanistan or Iraq. No, this is the battlefield of life.
Mm-hmm.
You got into Brown University, means somebody else didn't get in. You got into Chinese medicine school, means somebody else didn't get in.
Mm-hmm.
You were able to build a successful career, it means somebody else didn't have that opportunity. We all do that. To be in society means we're in a competitive world. If you're going to be in that competitive world, then you're not even in the game unless you play to win, right? But there's a world of difference between playing to win, where only winning matters, versus playing to win, knowing that how you play the game is more important than whether you win or lose. This is the thing that people avoid talking about, especially on the progressive left.
Mm-hmm.
You're not playing to win, you're playing to win, okay? But if you're playing to win, then how you play the game and how you treat the other side is as or more important than whether you win or lose.
I guess my last question, it seems like we're going to have to be struggling a lot together with each other, and out of love, right? Out of mutual support and love, and playing to win, right? And that would be a way of playing to win that is about process, right? Because it's
Right.
intended towards helping the other,
Right.
rather than out of revenge or pure self, pure desire for one's own advancement. As Buddhists, we're so much of our practice now is dharmapreneurs, and we're each individually enlightenment entrepreneurs, right? Each individually, it's almost like a provider client model.
Right.
Now, where you go on a retreat. It doesn't, there's still little holdouts, but quite often now it's like you're paying for a service, and that service is you have a teacher or a group or a structure, a center provide you this instruction and this envelope and this service, and we're paying for a service. And in that sense, it's kind of, that's like the death of any kind of solidarity, because we're just individual consumers lining up at the store to get our dollop of enlightenment. And so how do we bring back Sangha? How do we create Sangha out of like the disintegration of everything that's happening here?
Right. So there's a lot that we can do. Okay. So I'm just going to focus on 2 or 3 points here.
Mm-hmm.
One is we are living in an increasingly atomized society, and that also means it's an increasingly ghettoized society.
Mm-hmm.
So like-minded people, but also like-kinded people tend to come together. So when there's an issue, or even when there's like a conference panel to put together, if it's going to be on a particular topic, then they try to gather together their own tribe, right? And that's necessary, because when there are oppressed communities, then you have to stick together. But once you start to have the spaciousness of compassion within, then even without being overly intentional, the natural movement is to try to connect with people different from you. And in this society, that's especially important, to reach out to people who are different from you, gender, race, socioeconomically, in whatever way. So individual acts make a difference because they form bridges. Okay? Even if it's not in a community setting, they form bridges. Number two is to be intentional about forming communities that are not based on a cost-benefit analysis. So it's hard to do, but we all do it, right? We all do it with dogs and cats that we have in our home. We all do it with children that we raise, right? So if you can do it within your own home, then you already have the experience, you already have some skill. So then you can go and extend. And you can do that by making moves in whatever way works best for you. So whether it's volunteering at a soup kitchen, or collaborating with other religious communities on helping on some project, housing or food or whatever it is, or just getting together with friends once a week and reading an article that leads you in that direction. And then you build those relationships over time, whether it's 5 people or 10 people or 15 people. You can do it because we've all done it. And then the third thing I'm going to say is do the best you can, and that's good enough. So one of the problems with the political and moral idealism in our society is, I need to prove that I'm good enough.
Mm-hmm.
No, because that's never going to happen. Because no matter how much you do, it's not going to be enough, because the whole world is on fire, okay? So no one person is going to be good enough. That's just not going to happen. And part of the drive behind that overemphasis on this idea that I have to prove I'm good enough is it's a cover for trying to isolate moral righteousness on my side, that I'm always on the right side of political correctness, however you define it. Well, that's not very Buddhist, okay? We're all flawed, okay? Any discursive perspective we hold is by definition partial and distorted. So get over it, okay? But the other part of it is do your best, and that's good enough, because if you insist on being superhuman in such a way that everybody's going to recognize it, then a lot of people are going to have to pay a very big price to prop you up as superhuman. So you're going to cause a lot more problems.
Mm-hmm.
Stay within your means, do the best you can, reach out to those who are unlike yourself, and doing the best you can in that regard, that's good enough. What more do you want, people?
Well, that makes me feel a little better.
Especially this white guilt thing, okay? You just have to get over it. Just do the best you can, okay?
Yeah, and I mean, so much of online activism is, virtue signaling is an insult, but it's a true thing. Because identity is discursive and is written out. There's a literalism to what we do, where we're identified with whatever we've said or done in a very literal way that becomes our essence. And so everybody has to create some almost impregnable identity for themselves, or on the other hand, a victimized identity for themselves that is then reified, and that's what they are. And so it becomes it's a very interesting time right now
It
where
is.
those are you know,
And, and one thing people don't realize is, okay, so there are so many instances where you have to step forward and put a stake in the ground
mhm.
based on issues related to all these cultural factors, gender, race, etc., right? But from a Buddhist perspective, whenever you do that, you are going to cause yourself suffering. It's inherent because you're going to say, this is who I am, and I'm going to fight for this. The moment you do that, then that's attachment to the realm of form. It's necessary. Okay, it's necessary, but you're going to cause yourself suffering. So is it any surprise that you step forward and say, hey, I've been, my voice has not been heard. I've been suppressed, repressed, oppressed, whatever it is. And now I need to be heard. I back up people all the time when they do this, but it is going to cause you suffering when you do that. So that has to be part of the calculation. You're going to suffer if you don't do it, and you're going to suffer if you do it. But the fundamental koan is, how do you manifest your true self when no matter what you do, it causes a problem?
Yeah.
Yes. So the Buddhist response from emptiness is not on that plane. And the only way that you're going to be able to sustain any kind of social environmental activism is to draw on a source that doesn't exhaust you, either because you refuse to speak up or because you insist on speaking up, because both are going to cause suffering. And then the other thing I would add is social structural change is always evolutionary and takes time. How long did it take, and how many lives were sacrificed before slavery was abolished? How long did it take, and how many lives were sacrificed before women got the vote? Okay. So, but then it can't be the case that all those lives that were sacrificed, all the people who didn't get the freedom or the vote, that their lives were worthless. No. So identity has to come from someplace else other than that political social outcome. And that's where Buddhism comes in and says, if you stand on your true nature, your Buddha nature, your emptiness, nothing is wasted. Right? So, and then the other thing is, changes occur a lot more quickly at the individual level. You see somebody who really needs help and you give them that help, that change is going to occur immediately. Social structural change, it's necessary, it's evolutionary. So this whole thing of demanding change now, right? And I refuse to give up my nice home, my car, make sacrifices for my family. I get that. Why should you have to sacrifice when you've been oppressed racially, gender-wise, any other way? No, you shouldn't have to give up anything. But come on now, the movers who have really been the engines of social political change, Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, these people sacrificed. Often they paid the ultimate sacrifice. Gandhi, King, right? They knew they were likely going to pay the ultimate sacrifice, that their lives were going to be cut short. So think about the commitment it requires, the sacrifice it requires to move mountains, literally, to enact social change. But we can do social change on a very, very small scale. So individual acts are social change. If I see somebody in front of me in line at a grocery store and who's the only black person in the store, and some white person steps in front of them, I can say, excuse me, I think this gentleman was here before you. That is social activism, okay? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have to be enormous, but I'm also not expecting my whole town to change.
Right, yeah.
Right? So, the unrealistic expectations for agents of social change probably is causing more problems. Yeah.
And
So,
you also have to leave open the possibility that you'll do the right thing and still you won't get satisfaction.
Exactly, right? So that's where the notion of classical virtue comes in. Is classical virtue can only be cultivated, whether it's Aristotelian or Buddhist, when you do it for its own sake.
Right.
Virtue is its own reward, which is also in consonant with Buddhism, because you're doing it to be fully present, not in order to gain an external outcome. Yeah. So I mean, a lot of these things are pretty much common sense. and intellectuals and the Buddhists who make mainstream media, they tend to be intellectually very sophisticated. Okay, they can spin a very fine conceptual framework, but most of this is not rocket science. Okay?
Yeah, I mean, Desant's name, only go straight, don't know, and that's his whole. That's the a lot of other words, but he's like, only go straight, don't know. Like, very simple,
So
that's basically all you need to know.
So that was Sansanim, right? Sansanim.
Yeah. Zen Master Sung San.
Yeah, Sansanim his story is interesting because he began with social political activism, and then when he ran into a brick wall, which is okay, it was easy to identify the Japanese as the bad guys, but now when it's North Koreans fighting South Koreans, it's like, who's the right side? And that's what drove him on his spiritual quest.
Mm-hmm.
So even though there was some element of social activism that remained, the heart of his practice was spiritual, because he understood the limits of social political activism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow, Mark. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think we've exhausted almost every question I had. If we had all the time in the world, I'd talk to you about the Eco-Iki uprisings and the Youth League for Revitalizing Buddhism and all that sort of stuff. Maybe another time we can delve into history. Well, thank you so much. And would you like to tell anybody about anything you'd like to promote, or whatever? And I'll also put things into the show notes as links too.
So what I'll do is I'm going to send you separately a link to my private personal website, which is really my Dharma website.
Uh-huh.
And I haven't put a schedule events in it, but I could put a schedule events in it, because I'm already starting to book events halfway through 2024. So if people are interested, they can. And then I also have a number of online things, online interviews and podcasts and whatnot. So if people are interested, yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll put some content into the show notes, and when people listen to this on their podcast, they can check it out from there.
That sounds good.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Great to connect, Ben.
Thanks for listening. You can find plugs and links in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this, you can feel free to contribute to the Patreon at patreon.com/theliminauts. Till next time.